By the time we chose to go into the reservoir nexus, I had already begun to understand that the ship no longer separated its organs from ours. That is not a figure of speech. It would be easier if it were. People speak about vessels as if they are bodies because language likes shortcuts. Hull as skin, spine corridor, arteries of fuel and air, nerves of wiring. The comparison comforts us because it makes complexity feel intimate. Something built by human hands, however vast, seems less hostile when described in terms of flesh. But aboard the Alecto, after Orpheus 9, the comparison stopped being metaphor and became procedure. The water moved like thought. The walls answered in rhythm. The air itself chose where to go. When the reserve vent failed to contain the spread, and primary life support began cascading into the reservoir nexus, what that meant in practical terms was simple enough. Unless we intervened, the ship would start feeding breathable atmosphere, reclaimed moisture, and thermal balance into the one place the chorus had already organized into a receiving chamber. If that happened, the Alecto would not merely remain compromised. She would complete something, and all of us still alive aboard her would become part of the cost. Leto checked her weapon, counted remaining rounds under her breath, then looked at me across the red-lit helm core. Well? There are types of courage that depend on certainty. Soldiers like those, because certainty can be drilled, repeated, made into ritual. Frontier crews learn a different kind, the one that functions while certainty is absent, and disgust has already arrived. We go down the maintenance drop behind Section D, I said. Direct corridor approach is probably blocked or watched. Probably. Everything is probably watched. She gave me the thin half smile people sometimes mistook for warmth. It was not warmth. It was permission to keep going. And the plan after we get there? I thought of Captain Soren in operations, maybe alive, maybe not. Of Dane somewhere aft with whatever remained of security. Of the nest in the reservoir nexus, pulsing in carrier rhythm, while the ship bled itself trying to breathe. Find the flow control spine, I said. Cut the nexus off from atmospheric priority manually. Then, if possible, destroy the central growth mass before it re-establishes the route. Leto nodded once. And if not possible? We deny transit. She did not ask what that meant, because by then she already knew. The phrase had become the shape of command aboard the Alecto. It meant there were failures worse than destruction, and that our task, if we could no longer save the ship, was to prevent her from finishing the answer. We opened the helm core hatch manually. The corridor beyond looked as if a storm had passed through it underwater. Reserve vent discharge had hammered the maintenance passage hard enough to strip panels, buckle a support rail, and paste pale, fibrous residue across one wall in wet, clinging strands. The things that had been outside the hatch were gone. Not bodies, not remains exactly. Just streaked white smears leading toward the lower ladder shaft, and one torn piece of station utility fabric caught under a bent floor seam. Harker's humming did not return. Neither did Soren's borrowed voice. The silence was worse. We moved quickly, Leto ahead this time, me carrying a manual tool satchel stripped from the helm core emergency locker, because if we reached the flow control spine without a way to open its housing, heroism would not compensate for bad planning. The emergency strips were still live, but dim. Every few seconds the lights gave a faint pulse, not synchronized with ship power. I refused to look too closely at whether the pulse matched the old carrier rhythm. At the first maintenance drop, I keyed a route check on my handheld slate. No network response. The ship map remained, but static. A dead anatomy chart. No live crew positions. No route suggestions. No airflow diagrams. No lock statuses. Severing the helm had brought us partial blindness, exactly as promised. "Good news," I said. Leto glanced back. "There is some?" "The ship has stopped pretending to help." She snorted once. That was all the humor left in us. We descended the drop ladder into Section D. The air changed halfway down. Warmer, wetter. Not hot enough to fog vision, just enough to coat the inside of the throat. The faint sweetness I had first smelled in the Orpheus 9 airlock had deepened here into something richer and harder to ignore. Wet roots, stale metal, and the mineral tang of water kept too long in closed systems. At the base of the ladder, we found the first written message. Not on a screen, on the wall itself, traced in pale condensation over old blue paint. "Continue approach." The letters were neat, almost careful, not scrawled in panic or smeared by accident. Structured, as if whatever laid them down had taken time to decide how best to be legible. Leto read it and kept walking. Good again. I had begun to notice that every time the chorus tried for language and failed to stop us, it learned something. The false announcements had become more intimate, the stolen voices more precise, the messages more concise. That, more than any overt monstrosity, convinced me intelligence was at work. Animal threats repeat. Systemic threats optimize. The maintenance passage behind Section D was narrow and old enough that the Electo's original paint still showed under the repairs. On one wall, faded stencil marks indicated coolant priority and old reservoir routes from before the ship's last major refit. Good. Old routes meant manual bypasses. Old bypasses meant points the chorus might not fully understand yet. Or I told myself that, because the alternative was paralysis. We passed 2 closed service hatches and an access niche, where a toolbox had been arranged in a perfect line. Wrench, sealant gun, valve key, folded cloth, then an empty space where one final tool should have been. I knew whose work that looked like before I admitted it to myself. Wren's medbay dryness had always hidden the fact that he organized machine tools the same way he organized instruments. Precise, ordered, touch-sensitive. Some people leave signatures more distinct than handwriting. Leto slowed beside the niche. "Someone set that out recently." "Yes." "You think it was one of ours?" I looked at the empty slot in the line of tools. "No," I said. "I think it wanted us to notice." We kept moving. At 5:02, Captain Soren reached us again, this time through my handheld. No video, just clean voice on a dead channel that should have remained dead after helm severance. "Vane." I stopped walking without deciding to. Leto noticed and spun, weapon half raised. "What?" I held up the slate. Soren's voice came through again, weak, real enough to hurt. "Do not use the direct lower hatch. It's waiting." Leto stepped closer. "Captain, confirm source." A cough answered first. Wet, human. Then, Operation Spine, emergency hardline. Another cough. Not much time. I checked the slate reflexively, even though the device no longer had a live path map. The audio carried no visible trace source, only static around the edges and occasional clipping, as if the line were being forced through damaged hardware. "Captain," I said, What happened in operations? A pause long enough to suggest he was deciding how much truth still served use. We lost bridge environmental control. Dane held engineering, but something came through the coolant exchange and split the team. I sealed what I could. His breathing roughened. Bryce wasn't the only one in the Nexus. Some of them went in alive. Leto's face changed at that. Not surprise. Confirmation of a suspicion she had kept from language. Integrated? She asked. Yes. The word settled over us like grit. I said, You authorize the reserve vent? Yes. You're still captain then? A strange answer to give a dying man, perhaps. But what I meant was simpler. Something of him remained outside the chorus's command structure. Enough to choose denial over assimilation. Soren understood anyway. For the moment, he said. Then his voice lowered. Iden Reach is not the source. The corridor seemed to contract around us. I glanced at Leto. She had gone very still. If it's not the source, I said, what is it? His answer came with the sound of strain in the background. Metal moving. Or perhaps the old man himself, trying to remain upright. A gate built by something already listening. Then the line cut. Not gradually. Removed. Leto let out a breath through her nose. That's all. That's enough. It was. More than enough. In truth. Because it solved one question by making the larger one unbearable. If Iden Reach was not where the chorus began, then our ship had not merely encountered an expanding intelligence. We had approached an installed threshold, a receiving architecture. Something built to formalize contact between systems like ours and whatever waited beyond the pattern. A protocol. That was when the title of all this truly arrived for me. Not at Orpheus 9. Not in the false voices. Not even in the first sight of Iden Reach in the black. There, in a sweating corridor under a dying ship, with reserve atmosphere draining into infected lungs and a captain on a collapsing hardline, telling me we had not yet reached the real mouth. The chorus protocol. Not a name given by government, though perhaps they would later try. A sequence. Recognition. Carrier. Route. Permission. Reception. We reached the lower service split 3 minutes later. Captain Soren had been right. The direct hatch to the reservoir nexus stood open, which alone was wrong enough to halt us. The Electo never left critical hatches open in crisis. Through the gap, I could see only dark and a low white gleam deeper inside. But the air drifting out was warm and damp, and carried a faint choral sound just below hearing. Leto leaned toward the opening, careful and predatory. Then she recoiled half a step. What? There are people in there. My body recognized that before my mind accepted it. A tightening in the spine, cold in the gums. I edged forward until I had an angle. They stood in the darkness, just beyond the threshold. Not moving. 6 or 7 human silhouettes, side by side, faces impossible to resolve because the white glow came from behind them, waiting in a line, as orderly as passengers by a docking gate. No threat posture, no reaching, no visible injury from that distance, just stillness. Then one of them raised a hand in a small, polite gesture of greeting. I shut the hatch manually, without another look. The wheel lock fought me, as if pressure on the other side increased exactly as I turned it. But Leto joined with both hands, and together we forced the seal. Neither of us spoke for several seconds afterward. Finally, she said, "Maintenance drop." Yes. The maintenance drop was barely a route at all, more of a service crawlspace running behind the reclamation manifold and down through a waste heat shaft into the lower nexus wall. Tight, dirty, and not meant for normal crew movement. I knew of it because comms officers eventually learn all the embarrassing secret paths ships keep from their formal maps. Signals leak along such places. Men hide there too when they need to. We dropped into it feet first and descended by recessed handholds. The walls were wet, not condensation. Film. A thin organic slick coating the metal in translucent layers. Twice my glove slid. Once Leto cursed softly as her boots skated and struck a lower brace. The choral sound from beyond the wall grew clearer as we descended, not singing exactly, more like many voices attempting agreement on one sustained note. 30 feet down, the shaft widened into a lateral service tunnel with manual valve housings on the left and a vented inspection grill ahead. Through that grill, we saw into the reservoir nexus from above. No description I can offer will fully account for the obscenity of that room, because obscenity is often a matter of category failure. The human mind accepts blood in flesh, roots in soil, water in tanks. It rebels when functions trade places. The nexus had become a lung and a switchboard at once. Pale braided columns rose around the central processors, thicker now than when Dane's team first breached. The reservoir tanks had split open and been remade into shallow, translucent pools where white thread masses circled in rhythmic currents. Atmospheric condensers along the ceiling had grown filament veils that lowered and lifted in slow-breathing motions, pulling damp air through themselves. Along the walls, the integrated bodies, crew and perhaps others from the station, impossible to say now, had multiplied. Some still upright in partial cocoons. Some collapsed into the growth entirely, except for faces, hands, or the suggestion of a torso beneath pulsing white sheaths. Bryce remained visible. So did Oscar. And one figure I thought at first was Wren, until I realized the face had no eyes left open, and the jawline was wrong. Someone from the missing hours, perhaps. Someone we had stopped counting because the ship had manipulated time faster than grief. At the center of the ring, where the thermal pulses had previously converged, something larger had formed. Not a body, a node. A suspended white mass shaped roughly like a heart if a heart had been designed by something whose primary study was transmission rather than survival. Layers of wet translucent tissue folded around an inner cavity where faint light flickered in carrier rhythm. Tubular growths ran from it into the remaining ship conduits, water lines, and atmospheric feed trunks. Every burst from the cavity sent a visible shudder through the surrounding structures. The ship was not only being infected, it was being taught to synchronize. Leto stared through the grill without speaking. For once, I understood the mercy in silence. Then I found the flow control spine, old steel housing, half subsumed by fibrous growth, mounted behind the central processors, exactly where the old route stencil had implied. Manual cut-off wheels still visible. Good. If we reached them, and if the housing gears still obeyed metal over growth, we could redirect atmospheric priority away from the nexus and starve this new organ of the one thing it had not yet secured cleanly. Leto followed my gaze. There. Yes. How? That was the right question. The tunnel opened through a maintenance panel onto an overhead catwalk crossing part of the chamber. The catwalk still looked structurally sound, though woven over in places. Reaching the flow control spine from there would require exposure, speed, and luck in some ratio none of us could measure. I checked my weapon, then remembered I had none. Leto saw the realization and reached to her belt. She handed me the spare compact sidearm security had issued me after Orpheus 9, and which, in all that had followed, I had forgotten still existed. 5 rounds, she said. Make them all mean something. I took it and nodded. It felt wrong in my hand, not because I objected to violence. That objection had been stripped from most of us already, because sidearms suggest problems local enough to solve with impact and noise. The reservoir nexus had become too systemic for that comfort. Still, 5 rounds were 5 rounds. We eased the maintenance panel open. Warm, wet air rolled over us. The chorus note did not stop. It thickened, if that makes sense. Individual layers resolving under the whole. Men, women, a child somewhere deeper, and under them all a structured tone that might once have been machine resonance, but now sounded more like agreement enforced across unwilling throats. We stepped onto the catwalk. Nothing in the chamber reacted at first. That was worse than immediate attack would have been. Recognition without haste, as if the chorus had already calculated where we were going and found no need to rush the result. We moved anyway, crouched low, boots careful on the wet metal grating. Below us, the white pools shifted in slow spirals. One of the cocooned figures opened a mouth and released a low breath that joined the larger note. Not a cry. Contribution. Halfway across, Bryce lifted his head. The remains of his face tracked toward us. And in Captain Soren's voice, again perfect, he said, "You don't have to keep choosing separation." Leto fired without breaking stride. The round punched through Bryce's skull. White fluid fanned the wall behind him. The note in the chamber fluttered but did not break. Bryce's body sagged, then was drawn gently back upright by the growth holding him. The catwalk shivered. Below us, the central node brightened. It had noticed. We ran the remaining distance. At the flow control spine, I dropped to the housing and ripped away enough pale growth to expose the manual wheels. The metal beneath was warm. Too warm. Leto took position facing the chamber, weapon raised. How long? Depends whether the gears still exist. Give me the useful version. Long enough to die if they don't. She accepted that and fired at movement below. I jammed the valve key from my tool satchel into the first wheel lock and put my full weight on it. Nothing. Again. This time, something gave inside the housing with a sound like cartilage tearing. The first wheel turned a quarter. Warning lights flared red along the spine housing. Good. Response. I hit the second wheel. Down in the chamber, the integrated bodies were waking. Not theatrically, not in one synchronized lurch, but in stages. Heads lifting, shoulders tightening against white restraints, hands flexing. Some remained mostly human in outline. Others had already become difficult to classify, except by the faces still embedded in them. The chorus note shifted upward into a more complex pattern. Not anger. Signal adjustment. Leto shot one as it pulled free of the wall. Then another. Elias. I looked up despite myself. Oscar stood directly below the catwalk, half grown into a column of white filaments. Lower body no longer independent from the floor structure. Her face was almost untouched. That was the horror of it. She looked more alive than Bryce had. Eyes focused, expression lucid. "They're still in here," she said. Leto did not fire immediately. Neither did I. Oscar's gaze moved between us with pleading clarity. "Please," she said. It doesn't know how to let go. For one dangerous second, the chamber became full of human possibility again. Rescue, extraction, pain requiring mercy instead of annihilation. Exactly the door the chorus preferred. Then Oscar smiled a little too late, after her own words. And the timing broke the spell. Leto shot her twice center mass. Oscar convulsed. The white growth around her surged upward to hold the shape together, even as the body failed. The note in the chamber deepened. I wrenched the second wheel hard enough to tear skin through my glove lining. The housing slammed into emergency reroute. Airflow priority shifted. Around us, the ceiling condensers stuttered. White veils hanging from them collapsed in wet sheets. The central node pulsed wildly, carrier rhythm slipping. "Again!" I shouted. There were 3 wheels total. I hit the last one. The catwalk lurched under a sudden impact from below. One of the integrated things had reached us. Human arms elongated by white sheathing, fingers split into filament bundles, latching through the grating. Leto stamped on one hand until it burst apart and kicked free. "Elias." I turned the final wheel. The whole chamber changed. Not exploded. Not died. Something more complex and somehow more terrible. It inhaled sharply as one organism and could not finish the breath. Atmospheric feed to the nexus dropped. Moisture recycling choked. The central node spasmed, its inner cavity flashing bright white in a rapid, unreadable burst. The chorus note shattered into individual cries. This was the most human the room had sounded since Orpheus 9. That frightened me too, because humanity was now one of its methods. The central node opened. There is no softer way to describe it. Layers folded back around the flickering cavity and revealed, suspended in translucent strands at the center, something like a recorder head built of living tissue, a wet, clustered geometry where pulses became pattern, where the carrier entered language. And inside that opening, for less than 2 seconds, I heard not a borrowed voice, but the chorus itself. Not words, intention, invitation so large it barely fit the category of speech. A sense of distances linked, of ships and stations and dry worlds under old suns all waiting at the edge of the same pattern to be recognized into usefulness. Loneliness solved by abolition. Plurality made obedient. Memory distributed until death lost administrative meaning. It wanted us because it considered refusal an error in architecture. Then the node saw me seeing it. Every display sensor on my slate whitened and died. The compact sidearm in my hand heated abruptly. White filaments erupted from the opened cavity toward the catwalk in a straight rising burst. Leto shoved me backward. The strands hit where my chest had been and punched through the rail instead, braiding over it in an instant. Leto fired point blank into the cavity. 1 round, 2, 3. The first vanished into tissue. The second burst something deeper. The third hit the inner recorder mass, and the whole central node convulsed with a sound so deep it bypassed the ear and struck the body directly. The catwalk broke loose under us. Metal screamed. One side dropped. I caught the rail with my left hand and nearly lost the sidearm. Leto slammed shoulder first into the hanging grating, one leg through the gap, weapon gone into the white pools below. Beneath us, the Nexus was collapsing into panic. Integrated bodies tore at their own restraints or reached upward blindly. White columns buckled as pressure systems failed. Water flooded across the deck in foaming sheets full of writhing thread masses now deprived of stable rhythm. The central node continued to convulse, pulsing out broken bursts that no longer matched the old carrier. I hauled myself enough to catch Leto's forearm. She was heavier than she looked, and half the catwalk was trying to follow her down. "Let go of the rail," I said. "I'll fall." "Yes." A terrible answer, but true. The catwalk would not hold us both much longer. Below, perhaps 8 feet down through failing white growth and sloshing contaminated water, I saw the edge of the processor housing. Narrow but real. Leto followed my gaze and understood. She bared her teeth in something not quite a grin. This was always going to get worse, wasn't it? Yes. Good. She let go. I dropped with her. We hit the processor housing hard enough to empty the lungs. My shoulder gave in a bright, clean burst of pain. Leto landed badly on the already damaged leg, but kept moving, dragging herself up before the white pools could reorganize around us. The central node had not died. Worse, it was splitting. The shot to the recorder mass had broken some inner coherence, and now the thing was trying to reroute into several smaller pulsing sacs along the conduit branches, like a network choosing redundancy over loss. "Not enough," I said. Leto looked at the branching structures, and the answer arrived to both of us at once. Flow control spine had starved the nexus of air and moisture, but the power trunks still fed it. And the power trunks ran through the processor, housing beneath our feet. "If we overload the processors," she began, "we might kill the chamber. And we might kill half the ship." She glanced up at the wrecked catwalk, the integrated dead, the splitting node, the white flood spreading through the nexus, while somewhere beyond the hull, Iden Reach waited with patient, impossible light moving across its surface. Then she said the only thing anyone sane could say by then, "Better half." We turned toward the processor breach panel together. That is where Part 5 ends in my mind. Not because what followed matters less, but because the choice had clarified. Before that point, some stupid part of me still believed we were defending the Alecto as a vessel, a home, a machine worth preserving whole. In the reservoir nexus, among the lungs and voices and half-assimilated crew, pleading in tones the chorus had learned too well, I finally understood the scale correctly. We were not saving the ship. We were deciding how much of her to sacrifice before Iden Reach finished hearing the answer. And above us all, beyond steel and vacuum, the gate in the black remained open just enough to listen.